Pick that up, sweetheart. Those words hadn't been spoken yet. But they were coming. And Sarah Chen would not flinch when they did. She didn't know that Sacred Heart's chief of surgery had already pulled her file. She didn't know that Dr. Sterling was watching her through the supply room doorway right now, his expensive Italian loafer silent against the linoleum, his mouth tightening as he observed the way her hands moved through surgical instrument trays with a precision that exceeded every nurse on his staff by a measurable margin. Sterling was a competent reader of weakness, it was his primary skill, and what he saw in Sarah Chen was not weakness. It was overqualification, which was infinitely more dangerous. Overqualification meant ambition. Ambition meant threat. The fluorescent lights of Sacred Heart's basement corridor hummed like angry insects. The basement was where they stored the things they wanted forgotten, expired medications, broken equipment, and apparently, night shift nurses with 2-year employment gaps and sparse references that led nowhere. Sarah had chosen this basement shift deliberately. The basement was where nobody asked questions. The basement was where a person could disappear into the white noise of machinery and antiseptic and the kind of darkness that passed for invisibility in a 247-bed teaching hospital. She was organizing a surgical tray when Sterling arrived. 2 4 lines, color-coded. 1 18-gauge angiocath needle laid precisely perpendicular to a sterile field. 1 suction catheter coiled like a question mark. For surgical sponges arranged by size. Her hands moved with the fluidity of someone who had done this 10,000 times, but not as a nurse. The muscle memory was older than her nursing license. It was muscle memory that came from operating under mortar fire, from running 4s by flashlight in blown-out compounds, from the kind of precision that meant a patient lived instead of died. "You're very organized," Sterling said from the doorway. Sarah's hand stilled for exactly 1 second. No tremor. No startle. Just a pause, the kind of pause that comes from someone used to identifying threats in doorways. "Standard protocol, doctor," she said without looking up. Her voice was pitch low, the kind of soft that made people lean closer to hear. She had learned to make her voice small. Small voices didn't draw attention. Most nurses don't arrange trays to military specifications. That was when Sarah's left hand trembled. Just barely. Just enough for Sterling to see. But the tremor wasn't fear. It was something else entirely. It was the physical manifestation of restraint. It was the same restraint that had kept her from screaming during 2 years of nightmares, the same restraint that made her sit in her apartment with the lights off at 3 in the morning, the same restraint that had carved her into this version of herself, invisible, competent, untethered from everything that used to matter. "I like things precise," Sarah said. She finished arranging the sutures. She did not meet his eyes. Dr. Marcus Sterling was 52 years old, inherited wealth, Yale medical degree, a handshake that included 3 board members and a federal judge. He had learned early that people with nothing to prove were dangerous. People with quiet competence were catastrophic. A nurse who moved like that, who organized like that, who maintained composure when spoken to directly, that was the kind of person who eventually made you look ordinary. And ordinary was the only thing Sterling could not afford to be. "What was your previous employment, Ms. Chen?" "Contract work, mostly," she said. Still not looking at him. "I needed a change. The reference line on your application, it just ends. No forwarding address. No phone number that works." He moved closer. The smell of his cologne came first, something expensive and aggressive. "That's unusual." Sarah set down the instrument tray. Her hands were steady. She finally turned to face him, and when she did, Sterling saw something that made him suddenly understand why his instincts were screaming. Her eyes were the color of still water, and in that water was every quiet authority he had ever encountered. They were the eyes of someone who had seen things break. Things shatter. Things stop moving altogether. But that was impossible. She was a night shift nurse with a sparse resume and a history she wasn't discussing. She was exactly what she appeared to be. Wasn't she? "I prefer privacy," Sarah said. Her voice dropped another half octave. Is there a problem with my work? Sterling felt the weight of the question. It wasn't a question at all. It was a test. She was testing him, and something in his nervous system registered this as a violation of the established hierarchy. He was supposed to be the one asking questions. He was supposed to be the one creating discomfort. No problem, he said, but his jaw tightened. Just curious. He left the supply room. Sarah listened to his footsteps recede down the basement corridor, the sound of his expensive loafers clicking against linoleum, the rhythm of someone who still believed he was the most dangerous thing in the building. She waited until his footsteps disappeared up the stairwell. Then she exhaled. The tremor in her left hand returned immediately. 11 years ago, in the Sanjin Valley of Helmand Province, Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen had performed emergency surgery on an army pilot with shrapnel embedded in his abdomen. The condition was called pneumoperitoneum, air in the abdominal cavity that had the potential to collapse a lung if not treated correctly. There was no surgical suite available. There was no anesthesia except morphine and the kind of will to survive that only comes from knowing you've been shot down 2 clicks from enemy lines. Sarah's hands had moved through that emergency procedure with the same precision she was using now to arrange surgical instruments, muscle memory, discipline, the outcome-focused calm that separates people who save lives from people who just work in hospitals. She had been decorated for it. Bronze Star. Navy Commendation Medal. The kind of medals that lived in a shadow box she kept in a locker with a combination only she knew. The kind of medals that meant she could never walk away from the thing she was trying to leave behind. The flashback came without warning, the way flashbacks do. The compound was called Forward Operating Base Shank. The date was March 17th. The time was 2:16 a.m. The sky was the color of ash, and somewhere in the distance, small arms fire was creating a rhythm that almost sounded like industrial machinery. An Apache gunship had taken a hit. The pilot had ejected. He was 10 minutes from arterial bleed-out. Sarah was 28 years old. She had been in Kandahar for 14 months. She had learned that pain was information. That blood loss was mathematics. That the difference between a person surviving and not surviving came down to whether your hand stopped shaking before you ran out of time. She didn't shake. She never shook. Even when the mortars started landing 300 meters from her position. Even when the ground underneath the surgical table jumped like a living thing. She just kept working, kept her voice steady as she told her corpsmen what she needed, kept her focus pinned to the precise location where she was accessing the peritoneal cavity with a 14-gauge needle to release the pressure that was crushing the pilot's lungs. Air hissed out. Pressure released. Vital signs stabilized. The pilot's oxygen saturation climbed from 68% to 88% to 95%. His blood pressure stopped falling. His eyes opened. "You're going to be okay," Sarah told him. She meant it like a command. 2 weeks later, she was nominated for the Navy Cross. 3 weeks after that, the screaming started. Not the screaming from the battlefield that she could handle. It was the screaming inside her own skull that became the problem. The screaming that came at night. The screaming that came in the shower when the hot water reminded her of blood. The screaming that came when she realized she couldn't look at her own hands without seeing everything they had done, everything they had seen, everything they had failed to save. She served out her contract. She collected her medals in a shadow box. And then she walked away from everyone who knew her name and took a job at a hospital in Norfolk, Virginia, where nobody asked questions and the night shift meant she could work without seeing sunlight, without seeing people who might recognize her, without seeing anything that reminded her she had once been someone. The basement of Sacred Heart was perfect. The basement was where people went when they needed to disappear. Sarah finished organizing the surgical instruments. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. She could hear the basement machinery breathing beneath the hospital like a living thing, the ventilation system, the heating pipes, the electrical hum that never quite stopped even at 3 in the morning. Somewhere above her, in the brightly lit corridors of the main floors, doctors were sleeping in residents' lounges. Patients were dreaming their anesthetized dreams. The hospital was doing the thing hospitals do, moving through the night like a ship moving through dark water. And in the supply room of that hospital, a woman in blue scrubs was arranging surgical instruments with the muscle memory of someone who had once sewn intestines back together under mortar fire. She didn't know that Dr. Sterling had already made a decision about her. She didn't know that his mind was already working through the calculations of how to neutralize a threat that moved like that organized like that maintained composure in the face of direct challenge. She didn't know that by tomorrow, the real nightmare would begin. But there was a unit patch sewn inside the lining of her jacket, the 274th insignia, faded almost to invisibility, and that patch was waiting. It was waiting for someone to recognize it. It was waiting for someone who had served in Kandahar at the same time, in the same valley, under the same sky that never quite forgot what it had witnessed. That person was going to walk through Sacred Heart's doors in exactly 72 hours. And when they did, everything Sarah Chen had built in her careful invisibility was going to collapse. The moment Sarah hung her jacket in her locker and clocked out at 7 in the morning, Dr. Sterling was already in HR, pulling every string he had access to. He was already making phone calls. He was already asking questions about employment gaps and military discharge records and whether anyone could actually verify that the night shift nurse named Sarah Chen was who she claimed to be. The quiet competence had frightened him more than any threat could have. And fear, in a man like Sterling, always found its way into action. The cafeteria of Sacred Heart Hospital at 11:36 a.m. was a study in institutional fluorescence, rows of staff hunched over trays, conversations layered like sediment. Dr. Sterling stood at a table near the windows, his voice carrying the particular confidence of a man accustomed to being heard. 3 residents and 2 attending physicians formed his audience, their laughter already primed before the punchline arrived. "I'm taking bets," Sterling announced, gesturing with his fork toward the salad bar where Sarah moved with deliberate efficiency, selecting vegetables with the precision of someone counting inventory. "Our mystery nurse here quits before Friday. $50 says she can't handle real hospital pressure." The laughter came on cue, nervous, eager to please. One of the residents actually pulled out his wallet. Sterling smiled, the expression sharp as a scalpel blade. Sarah heard it. Of course she did. Her hands didn't pause. The tongs continued their measured work, spinach, tomatoes, cucumbers. But something shifted in her spine, a microsecond adjustment, the way a compass needle reorients to true north. She set her tray down at a table in the opposite corner, her back to Sterling's group, and opened a patient chart while eating. Sterling watched her eat alone. The isolation bothered him more than compliance would have. Compliance meant fear. This meant something else. Something he couldn't quantify. He pushed his chair back. The approach was calculated. Sterling carried his tray with theatrical purpose, his shoe catching the edge of Sarah's table, a stumble that looked genuine enough for the residents to notice. His lunch tray, a full spread of pasta and soup, tumbled forward in a catastrophic arc. The bowl connected with Sarah's plate and exploded across the table, across her scrubs, across the floor in a wide amber splash. 3 tables of staff went silent for 1 heartbeat, then erupted in surprised laughter. Sarah didn't flinch. She simply sat there, minestrone soup dripping down her chest, her hands flat on the table. The tear came unbidden, a single line down her left cheek, not from humiliation, but from the specific exhaustion of having to absorb this, again and again, in different uniforms and different rooms. She wiped it away without breaking Sterling's gaze. "Oh, careful," Sterling said, offering a hand she didn't take. "These things happen." He was still standing there when she rose, when she grabbed paper towels from the dispenser with 3 sharp pulls, when she began cleaning her scrubs with methodical efficiency. And then he dropped something at her feet, a patient chart, clinical notes, someone's medical history scattering across the wet tile floor. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Sterling said, his voice designed to carry, to establish hierarchy, to prove a point to the residents about who moved and who stood still in this hospital. "Earn that paycheck." The room had gone so quiet you could hear the ventilation system humming overhead, that insistent mechanical breathing that never stopped, never paused, never showed mercy. Sarah knelt, a deliberate movement, not a collapse. She gathered the scattered pages, her movements precise as surgical technique. When she stood, the chart was reassembled, the pages ordered, the patient's dignity restored even if her own scrubs were ruined. She handed it back to Sterling, and only then did she speak. Her voice came out low, modulated like still water. "I've sutured intestines back together under mortar fire, Dr. Sterling." A pause. 1 beat. 2. "Your insecurities don't shake my hands." The cafeteria didn't just go silent. It fossilized. Residents stared into their food. Attending physicians suddenly became very interested in their phones. Sterling's face flushed a dark crimson, a color that suggested rupture, that suggested pressure finding its way through every valve and seam. He opened his mouth. Closed it. The only sound was Sarah's shoes on the tile, walking away from him, walking to the locker room, leaving him standing among scattered paper and spilled soup with an audience that had just witnessed something they didn't have a framework for. That was the moment his certainty calcified into something harder. Fear. 2 days passed. Sarah worked her shifts with invisible competence, force placed on first attempt, medication calculations executed without hesitation, patient sedated and reassured with a voice that suggested she had held much heavier things than their anxiety. But Sterling was watching now, and more importantly, Sterling was acting. During rounds on the surgical floor, the team assembled outside a patient's room, 2 residents, an intern, Sterling, and Sarah. The patient was post-op, stable, requiring only routine monitoring and care. Sterling turned to Sarah with the team fully assembled, his voice carrying just enough volume for everyone to hear. "Nurse Chen," he said, using her full name like a weapon, "post-op patients need someone with attention to detail. Why don't you focus on the fundamentals? Bedpan rounds, vitals every 2 hours, linen changes. Nurse Mysterious can focus on what she does best, staying out of the way." The residents exchanged glances. The intern looked at her shoes. Sterling continued, "Maybe if you spent less time hiding and more time learning, you'd understand basic protocols." The medication order came the following afternoon. Sarah was restocking the ICU medication cart when Sterling appeared, threw a printed order sheet directly at her feet, not dropping it, not handing it, but throwing it with enough force that it skidded across the polished floor. "Next time, check the dosage before questioning," he said, loud enough for the ICU nurses to hear. Senior nurses know the difference between courage and stupidity. Sarah picked up the order. The handwriting was unmistakably his. The dosage was standard, correct, textbook perfect. She had never questioned it. But the nurses around her had all heard Sterling's accusation, and that was the point. Not truth. Narrative. Control. The ability to redefine reality by repetition. She walked to the medication dispensary without responding. But her left hand trembled as she entered the code to access the cabinet, not from fear, but from the specific discipline required to absorb this and not respond. Her hands had held people's organs in Kandahar while mortars fell like rain. They had sutured arteries under conditions that would make a surgical resident weep. The trembling was not weakness. It was restraint, and restraint was a kind of power Sterling would never understand. That evening, Sterling sat in the administrator's office with the door closed. He had made 2 phone calls already. Now he was making a third. His fingers drummed the desk while the phone rang, and when his contact answered, his voice dropped into a register of confidentiality, of men who understood how things actually worked. "I need you to dig into her background," he said, his eyes on the security office's data terminal where an employee photo of Sarah was displayed. 2-year employment gap. No local references. Advanced surgical knowledge that doesn't match her stated experience. Something's not right. He paused, listening. "I don't care if it takes favors. I need everything, where she came from, why she left, what she's hiding. And I need it before she becomes a liability." He ended the call and leaned back in his chair, the faint smile returning. He had launched this campaign in a cafeteria with lunch trays and humiliation. Now it was moving into the territory that really mattered: institutional power, network access, the machinery that ground quietly beneath any organization that wanted to protect its own. The machine was moving now. And it had a very specific target in mind. The monitors screamed first. Then came the oxygen saturation number dropping across the digital display like a stone down a well. 88. 82. 76. The colonel's chest rose and fell in the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator, but his body was telling a different story. His neck veins stood out like ropes beneath his skin. His trachea had shifted. Subtle. Visible only to someone who had spent 2 years in trauma tents reading the language of dying lungs. Sarah was checking his morning vitals at 6:33 a.m. 48 hours post-op. The surgery had gone clean, shrapnel wounds cleaned, the collapsed lung re-expanded, the stitching precise. The colonel had stabilized. Everyone on the trauma floor had breathed easier. But Sarah knew something the monitors hadn't caught yet. Knew it the way muscle memory knew things. Knew it the way hands that had held lives together in Kandahar knew when a body was about to betray itself. She pressed the code button. Didn't call out. Didn't wave. Just pressed it with the certainty of someone who had seen this particular sequence before. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space, compressing the lung again. The second collapse worse than the first because the body never expects lightning to strike twice. Dr. Sterling arrived in 32 seconds. She knew because she counted. Counted breaths. Counted heartbeats. Counted the time between recognition and action, and Sterling moved like a man walking through honey. His face was the color of old newspaper. He stared at the monitors the way a person stares at a text they don't understand, hoping if they look long enough, the words will rearrange into something sensible. "We need to intubate," Sterling said. His voice carried the tremor of someone reading from a script they hadn't studied. He reached for the intubation kit on the crash cart. Reached for the wrong equipment. Reached like a man assembling IKEA furniture in the dark. Sarah stood beside the bed. The colonel's lips were turning blue. A faint ammonia smell hung in the air, the body's chemistry changing, cells screaming for oxygen. His eyes were open. Aware. Watching Sterling with the kind of focus that comes from understanding, on a primitive level, that someone in the room was about to get him killed. Tension pneumothorax, Sarah said. Her voice was still water. Needs needle decompression. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Right now. Sterling's head snapped toward her like she'd struck him. That's not protocol without imaging. Step back, nurse. The colonel's monitor alarm wailed. A sound like a siren in a tunnel. 88 down to 64. His lips darker now. His breathing shallow. The ventilator pushing air into lungs that couldn't accept it anymore. Every breath was pressurizing the space around his lung. Every breath was slowly suffocating him while everyone watched. Sterling pulled the intubation kit closer. His hands moved with the kind of fumbling precision that belonged to someone who had practiced a procedure exactly twice in the last decade. His fingers trembled as he reached for the laryngoscope. Not the shaking of anger. The shaking of a man trying to operate while panic rewired his nervous system. Sarah saw the equipment he needed. Saw it the way a pilot sees the runway through storm clouds. 14-gauge needle. The decompression kit sitting 3 feet away on the secondary cart. It would take 5 seconds to reach it. 5 seconds to prep the site. 5 seconds to slide the needle between the ribs, into the intercostal space, and release the pressure that was crushing the colonel's lung like a fist. 5 seconds to hear the hiss of air escaping. 56 seconds total if she moved without hesitation. The colonel's oxygen saturation, 58. Sterling was still fumbling with the laryngoscope. Was still pretending this was the protocol. Was still pretending he wasn't watching a decorated Air Force colonel die in real time because his ego had overwritten his competence. Sterling's phone was in his other hand. Sarah could see it. Could see his fingers already composing the email in his head. Could see him planning her termination the way some men plan vacations, with meticulous attention to detail and the certainty that they would feel better once it was done. The Colonel's eyes met hers. For exactly 2 seconds. The same length of silence that had existed between them since the operating room, when he'd whispered, "You're that medic from the 274th, and she'd asked him with nothing but a glance to keep that information buried. He had kept it. Had honored something older than hospital protocol. Older than rank and chain of command. Something that existed between people who had watched the same things happen in the dark. The look he gave her now was different. It was a question. It was permission. It was a command. Sarah's hand moved before her brain finished the thought. She walked to the decompression kit. Didn't ask Sterling. Didn't wait for authorization. Didn't pause long enough for him to fully articulate the protest forming behind his pale, shaking lips. Her movements were automatic. Prepped the site. Swabbed the intercostal space with antiseptic that smelled like hospital and history. Found the space between the ribs with fingertips that had done this before, in a trauma tent under mortar fire, with a man screaming and blood coating her gloved hands up to the elbows. She didn't scream. Didn't hesitate. Didn't acknowledge Sterling's voice rising behind her, saying something about protocol and insubordination and how this was exactly the kind of unauthorized action that got nurses fired. The needle went in. 2 inches. Perpendicular to the chest wall. Clean angle. Practiced angle. The hiss came next. That specific sound of air escaping under pressure. The sound of a body getting a second chance. The sound of pressure releasing like a prayer being answered in real time. 68 on the oxygen saturation. 72. 76. 81. The numbers climbing the way they were supposed to. The Colonel's color returning. His breathing deepening. His eyes closing in something that might have been relief or might have been exhaustion or might have been the particular kind of gratitude that people feel when someone saves their life without asking permission. The monitor alarm stopped screaming. The room went silent except for the soft beep of the pulse oximeter settling into normal range. 85. 87. 89. Sterling stood frozen, his hand still holding the laryngoscope he no longer needed. His phone was still in his other hand. His face had gone from pale to a shade of purple that suggested his blood pressure was doing something dramatic and unpleasant. He was staring at Sarah the way a man stares at someone who has just saved a patient's life and, in doing so, made it impossible for him to ever pretend he belonged in a trauma bay. Sarah withdrew the needle. Disposed of it in the sharps container with the mechanical efficiency of someone going through the motions of a job she was about to lose. Because she understood exactly what Sterling understood in that moment. She had broken protocol. She had performed an unauthorized procedure. She had stepped in front of a doctor and made a clinical decision without permission or deference or the kind of careful politeness that got nurses safely through their careers without incident. She had, in other words, saved the Colonel's life. Sterling's voice came out like gravel in a blender. "With respect, Doctor, I'm not stepping back," Sarah said quietly, meeting his eyes for the first time with something that looked a lot like pity. "Your patient needed decompression. He has it. His vitals are stable. His oxygen saturation is normal. You're welcome to document whatever you need to document, but I suggest you start with the patient deteriorated, immediate needle decompression performed by RN Chen, 6/24 hours. The Colonel opened his eyes. Looked at her. Looked at Sterling. And something in the room shifted like tectonic plates rearranging themselves. Like fault lines realigning. Like the moment right before an earthquake when the birds go silent and the air pressure changes and the world holds its breath before everything breaks. Sterling's hand reached for his phone. His thumb hovered over the email draft he'd been composing in his head for the past 72 hours. The termination email. The professional assassination. The carefully worded justification that would paint Sarah Chen as reckless, insubordinate, and dangerous. but his other hand was still holding a laryngoscope he didn't need, and his patient was breathing, and there were 3 residents standing in the doorway who had just watched the night shift nurse perform an emergency decompression while their attending doctor froze. And Sterling understood, with the kind of clarity that comes from watching your own professional competence exposed under fluorescent light, that everything that happened next was going to be complicated. The Colonel's oxygen saturation dropped like a stone. 88. 82. 75. The monitor's rhythm shifted from steady beeping to frantic chirping, and Sarah's body recognized the sound before her conscious mind caught up, that particular acoustic signature of a lung collapsing inside a ribcage, air where blood should flow, pressure building against the heart like a fist closing around it. Tension pneumothorax. She'd seen it twice in Kandahar, both times in the dark, both times under fire, both times with nothing but a needle and the knowledge that the next 30 seconds would determine if someone lived or died. Sterling was at the bedside, but his hands weren't moving. His eyes tracked the monitor numbers dropping, 70. 68, but his surgical mind had disconnected from his body the way minds do when the situation exceeds their experience. He stood there holding a pen, his jaw working silently, the small muscles around his eyes twitching with the particular panic of someone who'd never performed emergency field medicine and knew he was about to be exposed. Sarah moved. Not asked. Not requested. Moved. Her hands pulled the 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this in a tent with mortar rounds shaking the canvas. She didn't think about protocol. Didn't think about hierarchy. Didn't think about Dr. Sterling's face or the 2 residents watching from the doorway. She thought about the Colonel's heart being crushed inside his own chest cavity and about the needle that would release the pressure and give him back his next breath. She prepped the site with chlorhexidine, her movements economical, precise. The Colonel's skin was still warm from the bear hugger blanket they draped him with post-op. She counted the ribs with 2 fingers, 1, 2, found the space between the second and third intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The anatomy was always the same. The human body didn't change, whether you were operating in an ICU with full surgical lighting or in a field hospital in Helmand Province with a headlamp clenched between your teeth. The needle went in. The hiss of air releasing, that distinctive sound like a tire deflating, like pressure equalizing, like life returning, filled the small ICU room. Sarah's hand steadied the needle while the air escaped, her body reading the resistance and the release simultaneously. Muscle memory had a language that didn't require thought. Pain was data. Sound was information. The Colonel's color shifted from gray-blue back toward something resembling human, his oxygen saturation climbing, 75. 80. 85. 92. The monitor's frantic chirping slowed to a steady, confident beep. 43 seconds. That's all it took. Sterling's voice came from somewhere far away, his tone the distinctive pitch of someone watching their authority dissolve in real time. You just assaulted a patient without authorization. Without an attending's order. You're done here. Leave the ICU. Now. Sarah secured the needle with her left hand while her right was already reaching for the oxygen saturation monitor to document the exact moment the pressure released, the exact number when the Colonel's blood oxygen returned to survivable levels. She didn't look at Sterling. Didn't acknowledge his voice. The Colonel's eyes were open now, awareness returning, and he looked directly at her with something in his gaze that transcended gratitude, something like recognition, like 2 people who'd spoken the same language in a place where most people only screamed. She stepped back from the bed. Her hands were completely steady. The residents in the doorway exchanged glances. One of them was a surgical intern named Martinez, sharp enough to recognize what she'd just done, smart enough to understand that the night shift nurse had just executed a procedure that would have taken Sterling 15 minutes of internal debate to authorize. Sterling's face had gone a shade of crimson that didn't look medically advisable. His fingers were curling and uncurling at his sides, his breathing audible, his professional composure fragmenting like old concrete under pressure. Sarah walked out of the ICU with her badge still clipped to her scrubs and the weight of what she'd done settling into her shoulders like a coat she couldn't take off. She knew what came next. Protocol violation. Unauthorized procedure. Breach of chain of command. Every hospital in America had lawyers on retainer for exactly this scenario: a nurse overstepping, a doctor with power, a lawsuit waiting to happen. She'd broken the invisible line that kept hierarchy rigid and protected mediocrity, and now that line was going to snap back and catch her. By evening, Sterling had made his calls. 3 board members. 2 calls to the sparse references she'd provided on her application, a VA clinic administrator in San Diego who'd never met her but whose name she'd used as a reference, a retired nurse she'd trained with at Bethesda Naval Hospital 8 years ago. She'd watched Sterling's message light blink on the administrator's voicemail, listened to him frame her as dangerously unstable and prone to unsupervised field procedures and psychiatric indicators in her background. He'd suggested liability concerns. He'd mentioned her suspicious employment gap, 7 years of missing work history that didn't align with continuous hospital employment. An outside investigator was already being brought in. Sterling had connections that ran deep into Norfolk's medical administrative structure, the kind of connections that came from country club memberships and board seat recommendations and knowing the right people at the state licensing office. The HR director called her into her office at 4:22 p.m. Sarah knew the time because the clock on the wall was digital and she'd focused on it while the director spoke, using the numbers as an anchor while her career was dismantled in 3 sentences. Effective immediately, your employment with Sacred Heart is terminated for breach of protocol and unauthorized medical procedures. Your security badge is deactivated as of now. You'll need to return all hospital property before you leave the building. The director wouldn't meet her eyes. Sarah packed her locker in the break room where night shift nurses kept their personal items. A water bottle. A sweater. A single pair of backup scrubs. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining stayed where it was, stitched into the fabric 8 years ago, so worn that the olive drab had turned nearly grey, the emblem barely visible unless you knew what you were looking for. She'd touched it thousands of times in that locker, a fingertip prayer to people she'd left behind, a reminder of who she used to be before she became just a nurse at Sacred Heart Hospital. Sterling watched from his office window on the 3rd floor. She could see his silhouette against the glass as she walked to her car, arms crossed, jaw set. He'd won. He'd eliminated the threat to his hierarchy. He'd protected his position with the same ruthless precision that a predator uses to eliminate competition from a territory. Sarah drove for an hour with no destination. She drove past the waterfront, past the naval base where submarines sat dormant in dry dock, past the neighborhoods where other military families lived their post-service lives in houses with picket fences and normal jobs and no nightmares at 3 a.m. She drove without thinking, muscle memory guiding her through Norfolk's evening traffic, her mind somewhere between Kandahar and this moment, between 2 versions of herself that couldn't exist in the same room. At 6:23 p.m., she pulled into the VA hospital parking lot. The intake papers were cold in her hands. She walked through the sliding doors and found herself sitting in the waiting room with 12 other people, all of them wearing the 1,000-yard stare like it was a uniform they'd earned and couldn't take off. A guy her age in a Marine's cap sat 2 chairs away, staring at a wall like it held answers. A woman with a service dog was filling out forms with hands that trembled despite the dog's steady presence, its weight leaning against her leg for grounding. An older man in a wheelchair had his eyes closed, his jaw moving like he was chewing on words he couldn't say. Sarah realized, sitting there in that fluorescent-lit room that smelled like disinfectant and coffee and human desperation, that she'd crossed over into a territory she'd been running from since Kandahar. She wasn't here treating warriors anymore. She was here as one of them, another broken one seeking help, another person who'd given everything and couldn't figure out how to live in the world that remained. The rock bottom she'd been running from for 2 years had finally caught up to her. One tear slid down her cheek. Just one. She didn't wipe it away. Her phone buzzed in her pocket at 6:51 p.m. Unknown number. A text message in green letters, "Mom, I know where you are. On my way. Marcus." Sterling made 3 phone calls within the first hour. Board member Kenneth Hayes, no relation to the Navy, owed him a favor from the cardiac wing renovation. Board member Patricia Morse controlled the credentialing committee. Board member David Chen, Sarah's distant relative who didn't know she existed, controlled hospital legal. Sterling didn't mention Sarah's name. He just said there was a protocol breach, an unauthorized procedure, a nurse who'd overstepped. The tone was collegial. The intent was execution. By noon, he'd contacted every reference Sarah had listed on her application, sparse, all of them, which was exactly the pattern he needed. A clinic director in Seattle who'd never worked with her directly. A VA administrator who'd retired 4 years prior and barely remembered the name. A physician's assistant from a field hospital in Kandahar whose contact info looked like it hadn't been updated since 2015. Sterling's investigator called each one with the same careful framing. We're conducting a routine credentialing review and notice some gaps. Has this applicant ever exhibited behavior that concerned you? Any instability? Any patterns of overreach? The questions were designed to poison the well regardless of the answers. Even silence could be weaponized. Even I don't recall could be twisted into notably unreliable relationships. Sterling hired an outside investigator named Marcus Webb, no relation to the colonel, who specialized in hospital credential disputes. Webb had a sterling reputation for thoroughness, which meant he was ruthless. Webb pulled every file, every interaction, every moment Sarah had stepped outside her assigned role. The needle decompression became Exhibit A, unauthorized procedure, breach of scope of practice, endangerment despite positive outcome. In hospital law, outcome didn't matter. Protocol mattered. Sterling knew this better than most. He'd been protecting himself with protocol violations for 17 years. Webb's report landed on the hospital administrator's desk Thursday morning at 7:43 a.m. 46 pages. Meticulous. The investigator had documented Sarah's appearance 3 weeks prior, unusually observant during morning rounds, demonstrated advanced knowledge of surgical technique inconsistent with nursing credentials, displayed leadership tendencies without authorization. He'd flagged her sparse employment history as suspicious. 2 years unaccounted for. A gap that suggested either criminal activity or mental health crisis. The report didn't conclude either way. It didn't have to. The implication hung in the air like surgical smoke. Administrator Howard Chen, Sarah's own last name, which was a cosmic joke neither of them acknowledged, called an emergency credentialing committee meeting for Friday at 2 p.m. Sterling sat at the table, composed, regretful, the reluctant witness. He spoke softly about patient safety. About the importance of maintaining hierarchy. About how even good intentions could compromise institutional protocols. He mentioned the colonel's pneumothorax was improving, which he presented as evidence that Sarah's procedure, while effective, had set a dangerous precedent. Other staff members might begin making judgment calls. The hospital's liability would become untenable. The committee voted at 2:48 p.m. Termination for breach of protocol. Immediate security clearance revocation. A recommendation filed with the State Nursing Board for further investigation. It took 41 minutes from the vote to the notification. Sarah was called into Administrator Chen's office at 3:28 p.m. Sterling watched from his office window as she walked down the hallway, her gait unchanged, her posture straight. She didn't hurry. She didn't slow. She moved like someone walking toward something inevitable, the way soldiers walk toward extraction at the end of deployment, present, but already gone. Security escorted her out at 3:51 p.m. Her badge was deactivated before she reached the parking lot. Sterling watched her leave, saw her place both hands on her truck's hood for 3 seconds, a gesture so small most people would miss it. The trembling wasn't in her hands. It was in the air between her and the hospital, the institutional machinery doing exactly what it was designed to do, protect itself, erase the threat, reabsorb the silence. That afternoon, Sarah found herself in the waiting room of the Veterans Affairs Hospital in Norfolk, holding intake paperwork with hands that knew exactly how to save lives but had no idea how to ask for help. The waiting room smelled like stale coffee and industrial cleaner, the fluorescent lights casting everything in a sickly hue. Around her sat young men and women with prosthetic limbs, service dogs, the 1,000-yard stare that came from having seen things that changed the wiring in your brain. A woman missing her left arm scrolled through her phone. A man with burn scars covering 60% of his visible skin waited in silence. A teenager in an army hoodie stared at the floor. Sarah recognized every single one of them because she recognized herself. She'd spent 2 years treating them. Treating warriors who came back broken and expected to figure out how to be civilian. Treating veterans who'd learned that the same hypervigilance that kept them alive in combat made them unemployable in peace. Treating people who discovered that the transition from warrior to human had a name, PTSD. Survivor's guilt. Moral injury. Transition disorder. All the clinical terms for the exact thing that had driven her to quit the Navy and walk away from everyone she'd ever loved, including her 17-year-old son. She'd been running for 2 years. Running from Kandahar. Running from the nightmares. Running from Marcus, who she'd left with her mother in Seattle because Sarah had decided that the broken version of her was incapable of being his mother. Running from the fact that her hands, the hands that had sutured intestines back together under mortar fire, might hurt someone if she couldn't control the tremors that came at night. Running into the anonymity of night shift nursing, where nobody asked questions and everybody understood that silence was sometimes the only strategy that worked. And now she was sitting in this waiting room, holding intake paperwork, understanding with crystal clarity that she'd done exactly what every warrior she'd ever treated had done, confused running away with healing. Mistaken invisibility for recovery. Assumed that disappearing would make the nightmares stop, when all it had done was make new ones. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that her phone buzzed at 4:13 p.m., and the text from an unknown number said, "Mom, I know you're at Sacred Heart. I found you. I'm coming to get you." It was Marcus. Her 17-year-old. The boy she'd abandoned. The boy she'd convinced herself was better off without her broken version. Sarah stared at that text for 47 seconds. The waiting room continued around her, the fluorescent lights hummed their electric hymn, the clock on the wall ticked with mechanical precision, the sound of a veteran weeping quietly in the corner reminded her that she wasn't the only one drowning. She typed back, "Don't come here. I'm..." And then she stopped. Deleted it. Typed, "Where are you?" The response came back immediately, 10 minutes away. "Stay there." Sarah set the phone down on her lap, her hands finally still. Not because she'd found peace, but because she'd finally run out of places to run to. Rock bottom, it turned out, wasn't a place you crashed into. It was a place you sat down and waited to be found. The doors to the VA waiting room were about to open. Her son was about to walk through them. And for the first time in 2 years, Sarah Chen, Senior Chief Petty Officer, decorated trauma surgeon, mother, warrior, refugee from her own life, was finally going to stop hiding. Everything that happened next would change the trajectory of her entire existence, but she didn't know that yet. All she knew was that the person she'd been trying to bury was about to be dragged into the light by the only person on earth who had the right to demand her honesty. The waiting room door opened at 4:22 p.m. Marcus stood there, 17 years old, holding a shadow box that caught the fluorescent light. Inside it, metal glinted. Sarah's breath caught because she knew exactly what was in that box. She'd buried it. She'd buried that version of herself so completely that she'd forgotten her own decorations existed. But Marcus hadn't forgotten. And nothing, not Dr. Sterling, not the hospital, not 2 years of running, would ever be able to bury her again. Subscribe to see what happens when a decorated warrior is forced to face her own legacy. Like this video if you believe the quietest people often carry the heaviest burdens. Comment below, have you ever underestimated someone only to discover they were a hero all along? And hit that notification bell so you never miss a story about the strength that hides in plain sight.